right, another lesson here from you. It's Howie, ha ha ha. So we are going to, if you haven't noticed the lovely motif here, there's water here and water here. So yes, we're talking about more water. As you guys know, water is incredibly important for not only our earth, but us as humans as well. We can't survive very long without it, so it's important to have it on this earth. But the interesting thing is some of that's going away. But let's talk a little bit about something different that we haven't really focused on yet. So it's talking about watersheds. And you might think, what the heck is a watershed? I've never heard of that. I don't know what that means. And really it's something that, especially living in Colorado, even though you may not have heard that term, you probably know what it is, not even knowing you know it. Isn't that kind of cool? It's like you knew something, yet you were never taught it, but it's because you grew up here. So when you look at this picture, a watershed is basically all of the ways that basically water starts as precipitation, ends up in these high mountains, okay, and runs off into rivers, streams, lakes, and then ultimately will end up in an ocean. So basically kind of the watershed is how, and I'm gonna simplify this, but how water from basically the atmosphere gets to basically the form that we see it here on Earth in rivers, lakes, and oceans, kind of more so the way that we can utilize this water, okay? We know that it feeds the ground and it does, help out with the groundwater over, underneath the ground, but ultimately, how does all this water become, kind of condensed into one area? And so that's a watershed. So think about it, and I'm not sure where each of one of you guys lives, but I live near Evergreen, Colorado. And so basically I have a view of Mount Evans. And that is a big watershed area because Mount Evans is kind of a water source for a lot of the surrounding places, even down into Denver, kind of like the Lakewood area. So that area is really, basically all the precipitation, the snowfall, the rainfall that happens, just picture this is Mount Evans, all of this runs off into something called Bear Creek. Okay, Bear Creek is a kind of a big raging creek at certain times of the year, and then can flow into different lakes, but ultimately becomes our water sources. Okay, so anyways, there's a little bit of background on a watershed. Now let's talk about those a little bit more in depth. So a watershed is all the land that drains into a common waterway, such as a river, a stream, a creek, or even an ocean. Okay, because some watersheds will eventually actually lead to an ocean. So in other words, a watershed is an area of land where all the water that is under it or drains off of it goes into the same place. Okay, so just kind of like what I pictured before. And I kind of like this picture. It's not as big as I would have liked it, but you can see this rainfall here. And basically you have this, the water that drains into either this lake, but then it can flow into these streams and down, and it shows that now it flows into the ocean. So watersheds can be that big where it basically goes from the start to finish being the ocean. So kind of interesting. So there's kind of a more in-depth definition of your watershed. Now the flow, okay, water enters the watershed by rain or snow, okay, precipitation from the atmosphere. It then soaks into the ground, okay, becomes part of the groundwater beneath the stream, or it flows over the ground downhill until it enters the stream surface. So again, some of that water is soaked into the ground, okay, that becomes groundwater. And that is necessary for a lot of things as well. But also, it can flow over the ground without soaking down, and it just runs into that creek, stream, or lake, whatever. Usually it runs into a creek or a stream and then fills into a lake. Okay? So the downward movement of water into the ground and below the surface is called percolation. Okay? Water that flows over the ground is called runoff. So those are two terms that I want you to be really familiar with. So again, let me touch on that one more time. The downward movement of water into the ground. So when it soaks under, that is called percolation. Okay, water that just flows down over the ground into a creek or stream or river. That's called runoff. Okay, so those are two terms that you'll see in your quiz. Now watersheds do have boundaries. Okay, watershed boundaries are determined by elevation or the height of land. These boundaries are the highest points or ridges that surround a body of water. So take for instance Mount Evans. Okay, you have Mount Evans, which is a pretty huge peak. It's a 14er, and it's surrounded by other large peaks. Well, that boundary is going to go over Mount Evans and kind of around those other high peaks because runoff if it precipitates, it's not going to go up and over a mountain, right? It's not like it has legs and it's all like crawling up mountains. No, it flows with gravity. So the boundaries happen to be these high areas of elevation because everything is going to flow down. So on the other side of these boundaries are other watersheds, okay, that flow into a different stream or creek or river. Okay, so that's what a boundary is. So all watersheds have boundaries, and typically it has to do with elevation because they're all going to flow into one source. Okay, anything that falls in a different source is probably part of a different watershed. All right, and then, you know, I was going to tell you guys that Colorado, of course, has tons of their own watersheds, and a lot of them are named. And this is, it's kind of a map that I didn't want to blow up too much because it might confuse you, but a lot of these are kind of many little watersheds put together into one bigger watershed that kind of filters into one big area or provides water for one big area. But when you look at the state of Colorado, there are many different watersheds, okay, that, you know, everything flows into one area. So the boundary is sometimes called a drainage divide because obviously it's going to drain in one direction, and that boundary means that the water or the runoff is going to drain in a different direction. So we call sometimes those boundaries drainage divides. Water flows in one direction on one side of the divide and another direction on the other side. Okay? All right, and then the last thing I really wanted to kind of touch on before we go into kind of the human aspects when we talk about how it affects us, but I wanted to touch on ocean basins. And there's a lot that I could actually teach you about it, but you'll learn about this more in high school. But an ocean basin is basically the land that drains to an ocean, okay? So, you know, this is a kind of a cool picture. This is, you know, actually from outer space, but you can see that this is land, and there's going to be watersheds that drain all the way into the ocean, okay? We call that land an ocean basin, okay? Because ultimately it's going to lead to the ocean. Now, there's so much more to that, but that's what I want you guys to know for that. So moving on, the human impacts. Again, we always have to talk about the human impacts, right? Because those are what impact us, and sometimes we're pretty selfish, and it's like, I don't want to learn anything unless it has to do with me. Well, the good thing is there's a lot of science in our lives. So when we talk about watersheds, we have to think about how we are negatively impacting our watersheds. I mean, think about it. As this water drains and runs down, we have inhabited so much of you know, this earth that basically our pollutants that we, you know, because of the way we live and some of the chemicals that are produced in, you know, whatever we're doing, whether it's a factory or, you know, however we're producing certain things, the water is picking up those pollutants and it becomes a part of the soil particles, so the water has some of those pollutants in it. And you can see this water is draining into the ocean. Doesn't look very clean, right? Doesn't look like ocean water. I don't think I want to be swimming around this. But that's what we're doing. So we have to think about our impacts. Also, we're lessening some of these watersheds. Basically, either we're changing the land because we're utilizing it too much, or we're using up a lot of water. So this was once a running, you know, probably a running raging river, and now it's hardly a creek. So we're also diminishing some of those watersheds by just kind of overpopulating and such like that. So I want you guys to just think about that, you know, because as time goes on, you guys are the next generation. Think about how you can maybe positively impact some of these things that we talk about in class. Okay, so the last thing, of course, I love to show you guys videos. So here's some visuals for you guys. So watch this and then we'll be done.
So what is a watershed anyway? One thing's for sure, it's more than a single river or stream. A watershed is an entire drainage region where sources of water, like rainfall and snowmelt, drain to a larger water body, usually the sea. They include drainage channels through rivers, streams, and the ground, natural filters in wetlands and estuaries, and sinks in lakes and oceans where rivers empty. Their driving force, the hydrologic cycle. We can think of the water cycle as a huge circle, an exchange of water from ocean to land and back again. It all begins miles offshore where the heat of sun evaporates surface water into storm clouds. As clouds saturate with water, winds carry them over land where they release water in the form of rain or snow, in a process called precipitation. As water reaches the ground, some is stored in the mountains as snow until warm temperatures melt it in the spring. Some soaks and infiltrates the soil as groundwater, nourishing both the roots of plants and underground aquifers. And the rest runs off over the ground surface, through weathered grooves, to creeks, streams, and larger rivers, and to a collecting body of water, usually the ocean.
So there you go, kind of a little reiteration of what I talked to you guys about. So hopefully that kind of clarifies any questions on watersheds. So we'll see you next time once again.